Looking at Irvington High School, what interested you the most academically?
You know, Sean, I don't really remember uh, anything except a fairly sharp interest in current events and political affairs, but even that was not particularly emphasized in my high school curriculum. I don't recall anything in my high school
Mm.
curriculum standing out. Uh, I had, a variety of teachers, some good, some not so good. It was not an exceptionally strong high school. Um, and so, whatever interests I might have developed in that period of my life had I been at a different institution simply didn't get developed. I sort of glided through high school, spending a lot of time working on the
Mm.
side, fair amount of time playing basketball, not much of a social life in Irvington High School. Um, Following sports teams like the Yankees and the Giants, and um, but it was not a particularly intellectual uh, center uh, of my life. I would say that I got an adequate education, was required to take a language. I took Spanish. I generally recall, taking the standard English and math and science courses that were required, but it was not a particularly significant period in my life academically. I think I graduated, in the top 10% of my class. Um, and I don't remember being highly motivated about grades in those days. I felt that grades were important. I wanted to do well, but I wasn't excited about the courses I was taking, and I wasn't highly motivated. And so I would sort of describe that as kind of a gray area in my
Mm.
life. That is, I got through the 4 years of high school like everybody else, thought I would go to college. College admissions were not nearly as competitive as they are today, where kids are doing everything they can to build up their resume so they can get into the best possible school. My opportunities to go to college were financially limited, so I had no illusions that I was going to wind up at Harvard or Yale, and I didn't have the academic record that would have supported that kind of an application. I expected to go to Rutgers. I was surprised when I wound up at Duke, but truth be told, Duke was not a strong academic institution in those days. I mean, today it's one of the better colleges in the country. Back in the 50s, I thought the undergraduate school was mediocre. And Duke as well had its dose of requirements. I remember having to take courses in religion, in zoology,
Mm.
at which I was an abysmal failure. I remember getting the lowest grade in my freshman class in the zoology lab practical. I got a 26, which may still be a record down there. Um, so I didn't get excited academically till I got to Duke Law School, but
Mm-hmm.
we'll get to that soon enough. But that was when I first began to feel that perhaps I had some intellectual potential that I had not been aware of before.
Okay. Well, you mentioned before that it was a real culture shock going down to Durham. What do you remember about those first few weeks and months down there, getting acclimated to North Carolina?
I remember feeling very much like a fish out of water. Um, in those days, it was permitted in most undergraduate schools for freshmen to be somehow distinguished or set apart. I think we had to wear a special hat to distinguish the fact that we were in the class of 1954. I lived in a dormitory with two other guys. One was Alan Max. The other was a guy named Bob Trebus, both from Irvington. And the room that we lived in was probably a little smaller than my office here. And there were three of us, and they would take naps in the afternoon, and so I would have to go somewhere else to get work done. Early on at Duke, I decided I needed to earn some money because the money I had saved at the pharmacy was going to run out. So not long into my freshman year, I got a job down in Durham at the S.H. Kress 5 and 10 cent store, which was one of the first lunch counters that was the scene of protests by young black college students in the late 50s who were denied the privilege of ordering a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. But that didn't occur while I was there. I worked upstairs, sort of in the warehouse part of the store, providing merchandise to the counters downstairs. I also remember very vividly feeling like I needed to spend a little time alone every day just to make sure I didn't lose my identity here in this strange place where half the people had southern drawls and the food was a little unfamiliar and the culture was unfamiliar. So every night, maybe 10 o'clock, 10:30, I would walk out of my dorm over to the Duke Chapel, which was a beautiful chapel. And facing the chapel on the left side was a little alcove. And in the alcove was a bench, probably made of cement. But if you could picture it, it had an arch on both sides of it. And there was this little bench. And the Duke campus, many of the buildings are made with this beautiful native stone, native to North Carolina. James B. Duke, the benefactor of Duke University. It used to be called Trinity College, and when he offered it a big chunk of money in return for changing the name, the Trinity College said sure. So it was a very beautiful chapel and a beautiful little alcove. And I would go sit there at night for a half hour and just collecting my thoughts and trying to figure out what I was doing here and what I needed to do to succeed. And so it was not an easy time. And of course, you couldn't call home because it cost too much. So to communicate with your parents, you wrote letters. I remember fondly, and I tell my kids and grandkids, that I used to eat on about $1.05, $1.10 a day, and I can tell you the menu. This was before I got a job at the dining halls. I would have a glass of milk and a donut for breakfast. The donut was a nickel, the glass of milk was a dime. I would have 2 sandwiches for lunch with a Coke. The Coke in those days was 5 cents, and the sandwiches were a dime each. And for dinner, I'd get the student special, which was 65 cents, consisting of some kind of meat or chicken, 2 vegetables, a beverage, and a dessert. Sometimes, if I was feeling flush, at night there would be a chow man who would come through campus selling sandwiches and snacks, and I'd buy an apple for a dime. But that first year, I didn't eat a lot, and that was what motivated me to get the job at S.H. Kress. And then starting in my second year and continuing right through undergraduate and law school, I got a job in the dining halls. Started out bussing dishes off the tables, and then eventually became a cashier. A cashier would receive something like $35 a month plus free meals. And so in my second year at Duke, after working as a cashier for a few months, I looked in the mirror and saw that the guy in the mirror seemed to be putting on weight. And that was because I was having lunch consisting of 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, and a milkshake, and similarly unhealthy portions at breakfast and dinner. So I finally straightened that out. But during the rest of my time at Duke, I had other jobs, but the dining hall job was a godsend because it enabled me to have free meals. They weren't that healthy in those days. The Duke dining halls then used a lot of grease and a lot of bacon fat, and I remember being introduced to grits and collard greens and other southern delicacies, but it was a great place to work. I had nice friendships with the staff, with the permanent staff, and I worked there through undergraduate school. I only stayed in the undergraduate school 3 years and then went to the law school after my third year, and I worked there right through my 3 years of law school. So that was really a godsend, and it was great to have that opportunity.
Were you able to get involved in any extracurricular activities, or was it mostly working class?
No. My first year at Duke, I saw a sign at Page Auditorium put out by the Duke Players. That was the drama group. And they were putting on a play that's now on Broadway called The Front Page by Ben Hecht. And I was always a little bit of a ham, so I tried out, and I got a part as an Irish newspaper man named McHugh. To the consternation of my parents, they said, what are you doing going out for plays? You're supposed to be there to learn. But I assured them that it wouldn't have an impact on my academics. It probably did. But I did participate, got a part in the play, and then in my second year I also volunteered to do some work with the Duke Players, and I was made the assistant director of a Cole Porter show by the name of Anything Goes. And so for the first 2 years I was fairly active there. And I think in my second and third year at Duke I got a job that paid $1 a day refereeing the Duke varsity basketball team practices. Now, Coach Krzyzewski, the famous Coach K, was not at Duke then. The coach then was Harold Bradley. Duke had a marvelous guard by the name of Dick Grote, who went on to play shortstop for the Pittsburgh Pirates. But during my undergraduate years, he was first-team All-American, and he was a very hard guy to call blocking and charging fouls around. He was a dynamic player. So I used to go there a couple days a week in the afternoon, and they'd pay me $1 a day to referee the scrimmages. I also had a laundry route. The laundry route consisted of me being assigned to a specific couple of dormitories on campus, and a couple of times a week I would pick up shirts from undergraduates who would put them in little laundry bags, And so I would stack the little laundry bags into one big laundry bag, carry that laundry bag on my right shoulder, and then on the other shoulder I would stack dry cleaning, so trousers, jackets, and I remember having the hangers draped down the front of my shoulder, hooked into the hangers that were draped down the back of my shoulder, and I would stagger down the campus with the laundry bag on one shoulder and the dry cleaning in the other. I would deliver it to the Duke Laundry and then pick it up. And I would make $7, $8 a week, which was big money in those days because you could live pretty well on $10 or $15 a week back in the 50s. So I made money with the laundry route. I made a little money refereeing varsity scrimmages, but my main source of money, aside from what I made in the summer and summer jobs, was the money I made at the dining halls, which provided me with free meals and a little extra cash.
All right, so we were talking about your days at Duke.
Yep.
Do any of the professors or classes stand out in your memory? Any mentors among the faculty?
Not in undergraduate school, no. Not. I did sign up for an advanced writing course with a famous Duke professor. I think his name was Blackburn or something like that, but class was over my head. I do remember vividly my freshman English instructors. I don't recall his first name. His last name was Hunting. And since I was a freshman, I was determined to make a good impression. So he would assign an essay every week. And I would take great pains to write these very ponderous, complex essays revealing all of my innermost thoughts. And my grades from Mr. Hunting would range somewhere between a D- and a C. Never did any better than a C. And one day in class, he asked one of the students who had grown up on a farm in North Carolina to read his essay to give us all an example of what he was looking for. And this fellow, whose name was McHugh, stood up and he said, I grew up on a farm. My whole family were farmers. I worked on the farm at least that's how I remember his essay. And he got very good grades. And the lesson that Mr. Hunting was trying to teach to his first year English students was you didn't have to write flowery essays. You could write simple English and get good grades. So that was a very hard lesson. He probably made the biggest impression on me because he scared the hell out of me, giving me D's for weeks and weeks until I finally turned it around. But the undergraduate school, as I said, was really not distinctive for me. I wasn't sure what to major in. I think I started out as a psychology major and then switched to an economics major. But nothing clicked. And so I was just going through the motions as an undergraduate there, making decent grades, but not great grades. You know, B's, a few C's, an occasional A. In my third year, I ran into a guy named Jerry Gibbons, who I had played a lot of basketball with at the Duke gym. And he said to me, you know, I'm going over to the law school now because I found out that you're allowed to enroll in the law school, and after you finish your first year, they'll give you credit for your fourth year in college. In other words, you can you can combine your fourth year of college with the first year of law school. And I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, boy, that sounds great. I went there the next day because I was not happy with the undergraduate experience. I thought it'd be great to save the money. And the idea of becoming a lawyer had been put in my head years ago by a seventh grade history teacher. Her name was Jane Collard. And we would spend a lot of time in seventh grade of grade school doing current events because it was the time of the Second World War. And I had really become excited in her class and participated a great deal and had a lot to say and was kind of opinionated for a seventh grade kid. And one day she said to me, you know, Gary Stein, you have an awful lot to say. You should be a lawyer. I think that was the only time anybody ever said that to me, but it sort of stuck. So when Jerry Gibbons said that, I walked over to the law school the next day. I got the application. I signed up. I signed up for the LSATs. I wrote or called my parents and asked them how they felt about it. And I applied for a scholarship at the law school. And as it turned out, I did exceptionally well on the LSATs, which probably reflected the fact that I had some aptitude for the law. They gave me a full tuition scholarship, which meant I didn't have to pay the $350 a year. And they accepted me. So in 1954, when I should have been a senior in the undergraduate school, I instead became a freshman at the law school. I applied for a job as a housemaster at the undergraduate school, which meant that I lived in a freshman dorm and supervised the activities of freshmen at Duke, which wasn't hard to do because you weren't allowed to have beer in your dorm in those days. Mm-hmm. So there was not a lot of it. In fact, drinking on campus was a ticket out of Duke. Mm-hmm. So it was not hard to be a housemaster. But they paid me $500 a year and free room. Mm-hmm. So I had the housemaster job, I had the job at the dining halls, and all of a sudden I was a first-year law student, which turned out to be probably one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. I've always said the best decision I made in my life was marrying my wife, Et, and anything else is second fiddle to that. But going to law school was a good decision, it turned out.
So tell us about that first year in law school. From other interviews I've done with career lawyers, that's a really difficult period.
Yeah. Well, I think it is, and I think it's probably important to make the year difficult because you're being asked to learn a different way of thinking than you've been exposed to before. And good law professors try hard to make law students understand that details matter, that facts matter, that this is not a profession at which you can do a once-over lightly and get by. It's a profession in which preparation and attention to detail and being careful as well as being thoughtful and being creative and being articulate all matter. So first year law school is meant to shock you out of your sense of complacency. It's meant to jolt you into understanding you are now in a different kind of intellectual discipline. I was very lucky. Because I hadn't really dug in as a high school kid or as an undergraduate in college, I was lucky, as I said, because the first year professor who taught the course in tort law is the law of negligence, the law of assault and battery, the law of libel and slander, the law that has to do with the rights of people to recover based on civil wrongs that are done to them by someone else. And the professor was a fellow named Douglas Blount, B-L-O-U-N-T, Maggs, M-A-G-G-S. And he was a tough guy. And for some reason, he picked me out of the crowd and sensed that I wasn't working hard enough. And so after about 2 weeks in his class, he developed a pattern of calling on me every day, often asking me to stand up. And then he would ask me a question, the answer to which was not found in the text of the chapter that we were assigned, but invariably was found in the footnotes. And for the first couple of weeks, until I caught on, I rarely had the right answer. And his response to me was a scornful, "Mr. Stein, don't you read the fine print before you come to my class? Don't you read footnotes? Why are you wasting my time coming here without being prepared, embarrassing you in front of the whole class?" I wasn't the only one he singled out, but he seemed to take a particular delight in picking on me. And of course, if you're in that position, there are just a couple of things you can do. You know, drop the course, which wasn't a good idea, or read the footnotes. And my decision was to read the footnotes and prepare for that class like I was teaching it. And so after a few weeks, he stopped bothering me because he realized that I'd done the work and read the footnotes and was thoroughly prepared. And it taught me a great lesson. It taught me the kind of effort that was going to be required to excel in law school. And of course, you know, the analytical issues that you're exposed to as a young law student. He would ask a question about, supposing you walk up to a guy and you tap him on the head to get his attention, and he turns out to be the only man in the world with a paper-thin skull, and you cause a cerebral hemorrhage. Are you liable? The problems and the hypotheticals that they would present to you were creative. They made you think outside the box, and they made you understand that the law was not simple, that it was analytical, that the purpose of the law was to find justice, and that justice was elusive, and that people had different opinions about what constituted a just result. And I was fascinated. I was intrigued. And so I worked very hard. I've told my kids a story that was kind of typical of the way I approached my exams in law school. After the first semester, we had only 2 exams, one in a course called legislation, taught by a professor named Livengood, and one in a course called Chattels, taught by Professor Laddie. The textbook in legislation was big, thick book, probably over 1,000 pages. And I had probably not devoted as much time to the legislation course as I had to torts and contracts and criminal law. So 2 or 3 weeks before the exam, I decided I'd better dig in and prepare. And I decided the best way to do that would be to summarize the textbook. Even though I had read the chapters and taken notes, I didn't feel like I had really dug in. So I set about to summarize the textbook in legislation, writing longhand on legal pads. And I, probably worked a couple of weeks at it. the summary was extensive. I was working many hours a day. And a couple of days before the exam, I woke up in the morning with an excruciating pain in my right arm. I mean, so bad that I couldn't move it. And I went over to Duke Hospital, and they examined me, and they asked me if I'd been doing anything unusual with my right arm, and I said, no. I said, I've been doing a lot of writing. I've been summarizing a textbook for the past couple of weeks. They diagnosed me with acute writer's cramp, and they injected me with Novocaine to eliminate the pain, but I couldn't write on the day of the exam. And I had an old Woodstock typewriter. I used to pawn it when I was short of cash, and the pawn shop would give me $15 for it. But I either got it out of the pawn shop or maybe I had it, and the law school permitted you, if you preferred, there were no computers in 1954, so you had a choice of either writing your exams longhand or typing it in a separate room, and I elected to type my exam on the old Woodstock. And I did get an A in legislation, so the work spent summarizing that textbook was worth it.